Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, the Jerusalem psychotherapist. In this week's Torah and Psychology post, I'd like to discuss the unique quality of the first night of Sukkot. We're about to celebrate the first night of Sukkot, and we know that the way the Gemara presents in Sukkah, the obligation of sitting in a Sukkah, of living in a Sukkah, Midaraisa, Minatora, the obligation is on the first night. That there's a special quality of this first night of Sukkot that we're about to celebrate. And this is actually discussed further in the halacha in terms of what happens on this first night. In particular, what happens if it rains. In general, we know that there's this ruling of someone who feels distressed or it's not comfortable for them to be in a sukkah, meaning that they are regarded as mitzta'er, that they are potter from the obligation of the sukkah. But on the first night of Sukkot, if there's a discussion of whether this applies, how do we understand a mitzta'er in relation to this higher level of this obligation of the first night of Sukkot? When it rains, does a person have got obligation to still eat in the sukkah, to live in the sukkah, to fulfill the obligation of being in the sukkah on the first night, or are they exempt because they are mitzta'er? So does this ruling of mitzta'er apply to the first night of Sukkot? And it's discussed. The Rosh and the Ran seem to say that yes, a person does have an obligation, that a mitzta'er is not pater from the sukkah on the first night of Sukkot. Whereas the Rashba argues and says that a person is not obligated on the first night of Sukkot. A mitzta'er on the first night of Sukkot is exempt. It seems to be this two-way argument of whether mitzta'er is pater or chayav on the first night of Sukkot. Just for sake of interest, the Gra takes it one step further and actually says that it's not necessarily about mitzta'er being chayav or pater, but actually we can say that when it rains, it's a pasul, it's a disqualification of the object itself, it's a disqualification of the sukkah itself. You're supposed to dwell in the sukkah like it's your regular dwelling place, and it's not normal to dwell in a place where it's raining. That's not your house. If there's a leak in your house, there's something wrong with the house, and you want to get it fixed. So if you're in a sukkah when it's raining, the Gra suggests that it's actually an inherent disqualification of the sukkah itself, and therefore you don't have an obligation. But aside from that, I'd like to see this we can look at it as a two-way machlokas over mitzta'er. Is a person who is mitzta'er on the first night of Sukkot pater, or is he obligated? But from a psychological perspective, we can just sort of expand on this and try to conceptualize it a little bit. What happens when a person feels uncomfortable? A person feels not in distress, but it's something which they just don't feel comfortable with. We're not talking about extreme levels of mental health distress or suffering. But on a general perspective, the world that we live in, especially in the Western culture, there's this idea that you do something because it feels good for you, it's something which you like, it fits in with your agenda or with the way that the values in terms of your level of comfort. Sometimes, and in more recent times, not necessarily as a criticism, but there is a Western culture that seems to suggest that if it feels good, if it's good for you, if you feel like doing something, then it's good, or that you should do it. And if it doesn't feel good, then you shouldn't do it. And it's often, from a psychological perspective, the compass of how to navigate the world can sometimes be whether it feels good or not. But this is not necessarily such a adaptive or beneficial guide to how to deal with different situations and how to function, because sometimes things are not comfortable, sometimes things are difficult, sometimes things can feel actually quite distressing. And in terms of, from a psychological perspective, there isn't an approach, especially in DBT therapy, of distress tolerance to help a person not to run away from the discomfort, but to learn how to deal with it in terms of mindfulness as well, to learn to be in the present moment with the distress, whether it's a level of acceptance that a person can reach in order to remain within the discomfort. Psychological approaches actually try to teach a person to embrace, acknowledge, to notice, and to try to learn how to adapt to a current situation, even with the distress that the person experiences at that time. And I'm not saying that a person has to suffer. It's not a sadistic approach, but rather the psychological perspective tries to teach a person a little bit more cognitive and emotional flexibility in order to deal with different situations, even when they are difficult, even when they are challenging. And in terms of this machlokes of a mitztaer on the first night of Sukkot, that they feel in discomfort, and it's not nice for them to have to be in the sukkah when it rains, or perhaps it's not nice for them to have to go back into the sukkah after they've gone out of the sukkah in order to fulfill the obligation. If we take the opinion that there is an obligation, that mitztaer on the first night of Sukkot, even when it's raining, is still obligated. From a psychological perspective, there's a message here that we can take out, that even when it doesn't feel good, even when it's not so comfortable, you have to do what you've got to do. There's an obligation, and that is the direction. That is in a sense, what's guiding us and giving us this sense of direction of how to deal with different situations. And at the end of the day, when you have to do something, and if it's an obligation, then you do it. And sometimes it might not be easy. Sometimes it might not be comfortable. So I think taking it out of the halachic machlokes, there's something, a strong, powerful, and meaningful psychological message for us of coping with distress, of coping with challenging situations, and doing it still because we have to, pushing ourselves through the challenging situation. I wish you a Chag Sameach. Hopefully it should be a joyous and peaceful Chag for everybody, and keep well.